All right, so we're going to take four classes to go through Egypt. You have two handouts on your desk because we might get through the first class 5 early, and if so, we'll just dive right into class 6. Heads up, your first test is going to be after we finish class 6. So it's scheduled for Tuesday, a week from today. Okay, so it is comprehensive, basically class 1 through class 6, or intro through class 6. Okay? So if you want to start reviewing your notes, remember all the lectures are online. Everything is there for you to review. Okay, so Egypt. What we're going to be looking at in this class, class 5, is basically the major Egyptian pyramids periods. We're going to look at geography, and we're going to cover pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. The first thing you have to understand about Egypt is that it's immense, not in terms of size, but in terms of longevity. It's probably, arguably, the greatest, most consistent civilization in history. It's kind of mind-boggling how long it is, how big it is, how much was produced. We talked about civilization in previous classes, and a civilization is cities, government, religion, social structure, writing, art. Yeah, they had all this. They did all this. What do I mean by it's immense?
A lot of culture, history behind it?
That, but also, where's my marker?
Was it because it got like
So just to give you an idea, construction of was in 2580. The death of Cleopatra . 2,530 years. Between not even the foundation of Egypt in 3100 BC, but just between the construction of the pyramids of Giza in the Old Kingdom. 2,530 years. Between the death of Cleopatra and today. Do I have that math right?
Yes.
We're closer to the death of Cleopatra today than Cleopatra was to the building of the pyramids. It's a massive civilization. It's massive. It's long, right? It's big. The other thing that's crazy is that it's incredibly consistent. Remember last week we talked about the ancient Near East and these periods of conquest and power. These different city-states that are fighting and that are going through all of these different all these different rulers, right? You have this ruler, you have that ruler, you have different art styles, you have different, types of civilization that are happening in a relatively short period of time. We looked at about 2,000 years last time, but it's consistently changing all the time. It's not consistent in and of itself. Compare this to Egypt. Just looking at the art, what's the difference? Not much. There's not much difference. It's like, oh, these were done around the same time. No, they really weren't. This was done around 3000 BC. This was done around 1000 BC. Oh, it's all BC. It's a long time. There's about 2,000 years difference between these two things. It's incredibly consistent. And that's why Egypt was so powerful for so long. There was a great consistency in its culture, in its history, in its art, in its religion. Everything about it was very, very consistent all throughout this period of time, and that's why it lasted as long as it did. Let's compare those two statues with statues that are also about 2,000 years apart. We have this statue of Dionysos from ancient Greece. This is towards the end of ancient Greece, but I tried to get two different statues that are about 2,000 years apart. And this is a contemporary statue of Pioneers Monument. There's a difference. There's big differences between these. They're not done in the same way. This is more natural, right? There's different clothing. There's a massive difference between these two, right? And we could go even further, but we could make it easy and look at some really abstract sculpture. But I tried to find sculpture that's somewhat similar, but there is a massive amount of difference. The races of the people, what they're wearing, but also the way in which they're portrayed. You're not going to see that in Egypt. You're going to see that in one period in Egypt. We'll talk about that in the Middle Kingdom or in the New Kingdom, and that's going to be kind of a culture shock to them, literally and figuratively. Okay? So, why is there this consistency? Actually, let's go here for a second first. We also have this immense talent for engineering and for building that the Egyptians had. These buildings are about 344 feet and then 480 feet. They were done pretty close to each other. This is just from a screenshot of a video showing the timeline of the world's tallest buildings. It took about 4,000 years for people to figure out how to build something bigger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. From 2560 all the way up to 1300. It wasn't until 1300 that humans built something taller than the Great Pyramids of Giza. 4,000 years. They were, you could probably say, rightly so, they were 4,000 years ahead of their time.
So like what? I know like we're not getting into pyramid, we might be, but like what do
Yeah.
they make pyramids out of?
Stone. Just straight up stone blocks. Lots of it. Yep.
It's probably like really hot inside.
No, it's actually very cool. It's like being in a cave.
Oh really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's so insulated from the outside. If you compare that to today, compare that to the last 100 years or so, we're breaking records in new buildings almost every 10 years or so. Right? This is the Woolworth Building in Chicago. This is the Empire State Building in New York City. Right? There's about 50 years difference between those two periods. World Trade Center, 1970s. Kuala Lumpur, the 1990s. Burj Khalifa, right? The Jeddah Tower. These records are being broken about every 10 to 20 years.
What's the last one?
That's a prospected one that's in also Saudi Arabia, I think, or maybe the UAE. It's not built yet. It's not built yet. I think it's something tower, I don't remember.
That is so neat.
How tall is the last one?
Tall. I don't know. I'm not sure.
That's the Twin Towers.
Mm-hmm. Those were the tallest buildings in the world in the 1970s. Okay. So this is something that's really, again, it's staggering when you look at what the Egyptians were able to do. Also, there's a consistency in their art and in their language. The art doesn't change. We already saw that with the two palettes that we looked at, with the two carvings that we looked at. But the language, it stayed the same. There were slight variations, there were slight differences. Scholars can look at a few things and say, yeah, there's some changes here, there's some differences here, but for the most part, it's very, very consistent. Okay, so why? Why was there this consistency? Yeah.
Wasn't there a change in religion though halfway through?
Yes. Yep. In Akhenaten. We'll talk about that. But the Egyptians tried to erase him. They hated it. They absolutely hated what was happening. Right? It was a shock to their sensibility of everything has to stay the same. So you think traditional Catholics are rigid? These guys take the cake, man. All right. So why? It's intentional. The Egyptians viewed it as stability, divine balance, and clear evidence of the correctness of their culture. You don't deviate from this. You just don't. Also, depictions had an impact beyond the image itself. When we think of drawing something or carving something, it's a representation. But the Egyptians believed that once you carve it, it somehow becomes real. They didn't believe that it came to life like the Indian in the cupboard or anything like that, but they believed that it manifested itself, maybe if not in this world, then in the next, or in some other kind of alternate universe, their mythology is very complex and very interesting if you want to dive into it at some point. But basically, to simplify it, they believe if you carve something, if you write something, it in a sense becomes real. So they were very careful and very precise in how they did their artworks. You don't just draw something just for fun. It was seen as almost a religious or a cultural experience. Also, tomb scenes of the deceased receiving foods, or temple scenes of the king performing perfect rituals for the gods. This is what we're seeing here. They believe they were functionally causing these things to happen in the afterlife. So that's why there's these elaborate carvings in the tombs. These tombs of the king and his queen, here and here, doing these ceremonies with all these helpers and all these people, they're functionally providing this to happen for the king, for the pharaoh and his wife in the afterlife. So it's like a religious ceremony belief, or a magic spell is another way of looking at it, if you want to be more judgy about it. But this is why. So it was set in these very strict parameters. It even went so far as, if the image of bread was omitted from the deceased table, they had no bread in the afterlife. If the king was depicted with the incorrect ritual implement, that ritual was incorrect, and it could have dire consequences for his soul in the afterlife, for his spirit in the afterlife. So you don't change it. You don't update this. You don't experiment with this. If you're messing with this, you're messing with his soul for all eternity. So you just don't do it.
Were they specific people that made these so like nothing got messed up?
So it would be under at least the leadership or the guidance of the priests of the temple, but it was all very, very much codified, very much set. Okay? Yeah.
So this is stuff that had happened in their life, and then they're just drawing it again, so it happened for them.
No, it is, so they would do these sorts of things during their life, but they would then also, it's kind of like the perfect banquet, right? You may not have had that perfect banquet during your life, but let's set him up with the perfect banquet in his afterlife. And let's set him up with seated perfectly so that he can, let's not take any chances, okay? So that's why there's this consistency in the art, because the art was not just decoration. The art was very important. It was religious, and it was real to them. Not to us, to them. Another thing we have to look at is the geography. There's probably no other river that's had more impact on such a vast period of history than the Nile. And we're not just talking about the ancient Egyptians, we're talking about the current Egyptians as well. So a couple things we have to look at. We have to understand about geography before we get into the art. Yeah?
Is the Nile smaller than it used to be? Or like, has it like kind of dried up?
There are some dams in certain places, but not really. It's still pretty lush.
So it was really big. How wide is the Nile? I'd like the widest.
It can get pretty wide in places. I don't know specifically. Not more than half a mile, I would think, but I'm not 100% certain. The Nile is backwards. We're used to rivers, especially in North America, flowing north to south. This one flows south to north. When we talk about the upper Nile, this is the upper Nile, right? Upper Nile in terms of flow. This is the lower Nile, okay? So just kind of reverse your thinking. This is all coming from the mountains and the snow melt from down here, and it's heading north, okay? So we're going to be talking about the upper Nile and the lower Nile. Again, just think of those as reversed. It gave water and fed the lands. Each year, there were melting snows in the headlands. The river overflowed every year, right? So there was these snow in the spring. The snow melts, and then there were these floods, and it overflowed its banks. And this provided this kind of fertile area. You can see from the satellite image, there's the Red Sea here. You can see, if you look, there's this tiny little river here, right? But this is how much it irrigates the land along the side. So it's just this tiny little river snaking through here, but it's irrigating all this area. And then there's a lake here, again, and then this whole area is all irrigated because of, the delta of the Nile.
Sorry, how did it overflow again? Every year?
So every year there's this snow melt, and then that caused almost like flooding down the Nile.
It snowed in Egypt?
up in the mountains down in, yep.
That's so cool.
And then today, if you look at a satellite image at night, you can see exactly how
Oh my gosh.
all the population centers are directly around the Nile.
Oh my goodness.
Why wouldn't you be, right? Why would you build a city in the middle of the desert? We're stupid. Anyway, okay, so this is, again, this is the Red Sea. So you can kind of see how there's that boundary there. And then this is Israel and Jerusalem, all that stuff, Syria. Okay? All right, so let's look at the pre-dynastic period. The pre-dynastic period, this is kind of the prehistory of Egypt. There was civilization there. There were cultures that were starting to develop there, but it's not really what we would call Egyptian culture. So scholars call this the pre-dynastic period from 5000 to 3100 BC. There were Paleolithic, Neolithic groups stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Archaeologists are able to figure out that they came from those same people that we were looking at the very beginning of time, very beginning of history in the Fertile Crescent, and then they migrated down to the Nile. And we have all these different figurines, and they look sort of similar to what we've already seen in some of these, in some of the ancient Near East. We have these, figures of women that were totems that were carried around. Pottery, we haven't looked at much pottery yet, but we will. Again, other totems of women for, again, that's going to be consistent across all cultures, across all times. These little devotional figurines of women for fertility, good childbirth, all that kind of stuff. But then we also have these palettes, right? This was a very early form of art that showed the importance of the ruler of the time. So whether it's the chief or the king or whatever they had. So again, there's a lot of consistency between what we've seen in the past and what we're seeing today. But it starts to develop a little bit, right? Still we have lions under the leadership of the king, who's kind of cut off here, attacking the enemies. Again, lions. It's always going to be the king and the lion. There's always that correlation. Again, just another sculpture. This one is in ivory. King, lion. And then we start to see some early mythology, some of the early mythology of Egypt. This is the king of the Upper Nile. We can tell it's the Upper Nile because of the helmet that he's wearing, the ceremonial fan off to the side, and then the scorpion god, depictions of the scorpion god and the sun. So the mythology starts to develop around this time. We start to hear a little bit more about the mythology. Yeah.
So is there a king of the Lower Nile too?
Uh-huh. Yep. And
I
we'll,
thought there was only one king at a time for Egypt.
so right around 3100 BC, we have this, we have a king who comes to unite all of Egypt. So, and there's going to be some battles. There's going to be some battles between the Upper Nile, the settlements in the Upper Nile and the Lower Nile. But in 3100 BC, there's this, I forgot his name. I don't remember who. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll get to it. And he basically unites all of Egypt under one rule. So yes, there was a king of the Upper Nile and there was a king of the Lower Nile. But when we talk about the pharaoh, the main pharaoh of Egypt, we're generally referring to someone who is, who's the ruler of both areas. 3100 BC. Yep. When we talk about Egypt, we measure time in dynasties. So there were these dynasties. Mainly what we're going to be looking at is Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. We're going to have a class on each of those three. Again, there's intermediate periods. And then we have what's called the late period, and then the Ptolemaic period. We're going to kind of put all of this into the New Kingdom area. We're going to put this in the Middle Kingdom. We're going to put this into the Old Kingdom. So there's broadly three periods, but there's all these kind of intermediate periods. This is when different families of rulers are starting to take hold. It's similar to a dynasty in any other monarchical system, right? You have kings who are of one family, and then maybe there's no descendant. Okay, so we need to figure out another, okay, that sets up the House of Windsor, that sets up the House of, we have the same sort of thing happening in our cultures today. Yeah.
Is this our paper you gave us?
No, we'll have the dates in each of the periods that we're going to be looking at, so you don't need to worry about this right now. On a test, I'm not going to ask you what are the dates of the old period. I don't like asking dates, so don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I need you to know roughly what we're talking about, but it's not going to be like, what are the dates of the second intermediate? I don't care. It's not important. Don't care. Okay? But here's the thing that you need to know. Time was measured in dynasties. So these divisions were created in the first Western style history of Egypt. They didn't measure it in their own time. They measured it based on the ruler. So similar to how we looked at before when we saw these plaques of the popes in the 5th year of the reign of whatever, very similar to how the Romans did it as well. That's how they measured their time. So it would be in the 5th year of the reign of such and such ruler. That's how they kind of told their time. But we don't really get into the dynasty system until an Egyptian priest named Manetho in the 3rd century. All told, there were 33 different dynasties. And again, a dynasty is not one individual ruler, it's a set of rulers. So grandfather, son, grandson, right? And then maybe the grandson doesn't have any heirs. All right, so then it's going to be the high priest. He's going to take over. All right, now that's a new dynasty. So it's a family unit, right? And then we're going to look at these different periods. So there's 33 dynasties and 3 ages: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. Okay? How do we know about these dynasties? How do we know about these different kings? Well, the Egyptians were very good record keepers. They kept records of everything, from snowfall way down in the south to the flooding of the Nile to everything. And so they kept track of their king lists as well. This is called king list, and this was done in tombs, and these were done in temples. These were done in all sorts of places. It was sort of like a calendar. It was sort of like a backwards calendar, a history of the rulers. And so on the wall here, we see all these depictions of these previous kings, and then some information telling us more about who they were and what was going on. And these were usually carved, again, by priests to show to show what? To show this correlation between the past and the current, similar to what Saddam Hussein was doing with the ancient rulers, right? With Hammurabi, etc. There's this correlation between the past and the new, right? And so each of these symbols is a symbol of one king throughout time, right? So I can't read hieroglyphics, couldn't tell you what these mean, but this probably has something to do with saying this is a king. I don't know, I'm guessing. But then these are specific depictions of that. Yeah.
How were people able to learn how to read hieroglyphics? Because like, who was there to tell them how to read it?
Great question. Let's talk about it. So hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics is a pictorial language. Okay. The word hieroglyphic comes from the Greek for sacred carvings. They didn't call it hieroglyphics. They just called it writing.
Pictorial just means pictures.
Mm-hmm. And the Egyptians really invented the pictorial script. In the ancient Near East, we do have some pictorial script, but it was also combined with cuneiform, with these other carvings. The Egyptians came up with this system of purely pictographic writing. Now, over time, they're going to come up with an alphabet of their own, but early on, it's going to be purely hieroglyphics. We see these hieroglyphics come to fore in about 3000 BC. And this is what we call kind of the beginning of the Egyptian civilization. So 3100 BC, we have these two kingdoms that are united. Around 3000 BC, we have the emergence of hieroglyphics. And so that's why we usually call 3100 or 3000 BC really the start of the Egyptian civilization. Before this, it's all kind of prehistory. Yeah.
Do they read right to left or left to right?
I believe it's left to right, but they would also do up to down. Just depends on the situation.
I'll make one.
Yep.
They do either.
I think so. I'm not an expert in this, but I think that's correct. It was based on images. Egyptian script was more than just picture writing. So each picture, each glyph served one of three functions. It could represent the image of a thing or an action, or it could stand for a sound or the sounds of one to as many as 3 syllables, or it could clarify the other glyphs. So for instance, let's see if I can find one here. I can't, because I'm not an expert in this, so I don't know. So if there's just a picture, just one picture, and that is a word just by itself, they would do a single hash mark afterwards, meaning this is the word. You don't need to look for anything else. If there are multiple figures that are trying to form a word, then they're not going to have that hash after. So for instance, so they're going to have some depiction or some carving, some writing that's going to show how to read it, but then there's going to be some that shows just the word itself, and then there's some that are kind of like syllables. Okay, so for instance, one of the syllables is moon, or Ra, or Amun, right? So there's going to be symbols like that, and then you can combine them into different words. So kind of similar to how Chinese Japanese is today. You know, various figures kind of put together form a word, but it's going to be kind of a lot based on context.
So they still had like a language, like they
Yeah.
spoke to each
Oh yeah.
other.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Writing hieroglyphics required artistic skill. Right. You had to be able to do it right, and also remember it was usually pretty sacred, so you don't just leave it to anyone to do it. So it was really only the high-ranking or the priests that were able to do it. Only those privileged with an extensive education were able to read and write hieroglyphics. Others used a simpler language. So this is called Demotic script, and this came about much later. And this was more of what the common people would do, but even still, the common people didn't read and write. Right? Even though the Egyptians invented papyrus, that was the first form of paper, even still the regular people didn't read and write. It was meant for record keeping, it was meant for religious ceremonies, and that's about it. So there is this Demotic. It's loosely based off hieroglyphics, but it's closer to an alphabet than what we would have today. All right, so to your question, how do we know what hieroglyphics means? Well, right around 300 AD, I believe, we have this conquering of Egypt by the Greek. Sorry, it was before. It was 300 BC. We have the conquering of Egypt by the Greeks. And during this period of conquest, which lasted around 300 BC all the way up to just after AD, basically both the Greeks and then later the Romans kind of whitewash hieroglyphics. They get rid of any depiction of hieroglyphics. It's what a conquering nation does, right? You impose your own culture on the people. And so all of our knowledge about hieroglyphics was lost at this time. There was no one left who knew how to read and write hieroglyphics. Until we get to the discovery of what was called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was discovered about 1,500 years later, and this was a game changer because up here we have hieroglyphics, down here we have Demotic, and down here we have Greek. And what scholars realize is that this is saying the exact same thing in 3 different languages. And this was the key. This was what they needed because they couldn't figure out how to read hieroglyphics. But we don't know really why they did it in the 3 languages, but we're really glad they did because without this, we wouldn't have been able to figure it out. So now we can read Demotic, now we can read hieroglyphics.
They kept record on like pretty much everything. Couldn't we find out a way how they built pyramids?
Probably.
I'm saying 'cause they kept records of everything.
And we'll talk more about the pyramids, you know, and how they did it. But yeah, I mean, we kind of know how they did it. Basically, slaves. It's just you put enough manpower and you can build anything. I mean, it's kind of as simple as that. When you don't care about the people, you can do it. So here's just a small example of one word in each
That's crazy.
of each of the languages.
So what were the 3 languages?
So hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek.
So Demotic was the with the lower class.
Mm-hmm. The day-to-day type of language.
Okay.
And so in this Rosetta Stone, there's Rosetta Stone I need to learn more about the history of it. I don't know much about it, and I should. But if you look down here, this says Ptolemaios, right, in Greek. Ptolemaios. There's the pi, the tau, right, Ptolemaios. This must have been done later on in when the Greeks were starting to come to Egypt, because that's a Greek name. And so here's the Greek name for Ptolemaios in hieroglyphic and then in Demotic, right? So with a combination of these things, are able to figure it out. Okay, there's more about hieroglyphics that I'd like you to read. I don't have it on a handout, but just go to the art history page. So it's the website. Yep. And then it's
Like homework?
yep. So class 5 rating, it's on there. Okay? And that gives some more information about hieroglyphics that you're going to need to know before we get into the rest. Well, not before we get into the rest, but as we get into the rest. All right, so we have a few minutes. Let's get started on the other one. So this is class 6. Any questions on any of that, by the way?
No.
Okay.
Are we going to get into any details of like the specific rulers or anything like that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, right there.
By the way, this is what Giza looks like today. Pyramids are not out in the middle of the desert. Okay, so here's where we are. So 3100 BC, the foundation of Egypt, and we're looking basically at the Old Kingdom here. And that goes about 500 years.
Give her my lid. My highlighter.
Found it.
Oh.
There it is. All right, so let's dig into, this is just 2 minutes. You have this handout here. This guy's going to go fast. Don't worry, you don't have to know all of the relationships. You just have to basically know the names of the gods. How do I start this? Here we go.
Why is it like a bird?
At the beginning of time, there was only Nun, the primeval waters of chaos. Then, in a great flood, the sun god Atum rose from the water and willed himself into creation. Atum then created air, a son he named Shu, and moisture, a daughter he named Tefnut. They were the first divine pair and soon had children of their own, the earth named Geb and the sky called Nut. The second divine pair then had 4 children of their own, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, completing the group of 9 primeval gods known as the Aeneid. Osiris then married his sister Isis, and the two ruled over Egypt together in an unprecedented time of peace and prosperity. However, their jealous brother Seth desired the throne for himself and murdered Osiris, dismembering his body and scattering the parts across the land. Isis then searched for the pieces of her husband's body, and with the help of her sister Nephthys, was eventually able to collect them. With the help of the scholar god Thoth and the funerary god Anubis, Isis was able to reconstruct Osiris, creating the first mummy. Osiris impregnated Isis after his resurrection, however he was too weak to remain in the world, instead travelling to the Duat, the land of the dead where he became lord. Seth then took the throne for himself, forcing Isis to flee and give birth to her son Horus in hiding. She raised Horus until he was an adult and able to challenge his uncle Seth for the throne. After a violent contest, the case was settled in a divine legal trial hosted by the Aeneid. Acting as judge was Geb, god of the earth, who ruled in favour of Horus, who then took his rightful place as king of Egypt. Future pharaohs claimed descent from Horus, with it being this divine ancestry that gave them the right to rule.
Okay, so that went fast. We have the sun god, Ra. He's up at the top, right? Very similar to creation story. right? The Old Testament creation story. There was a great flood. Huh, sounds familiar, right? There are these four gods called the Aeneid. Again, that's a name that the Egyptian or that the Greeks gave to the system. So we have Shu, Tefnet, Geb, and Nut. Those Aeni, Aeiaed, something like that. Something like that. I'm not sure. And Aeneid, Aeneid. Yeah. There we go. So then between those four, Shu, Tefnet, Geb, and Nut, they produce the four gods below. So we have Isis, Osiris, Nephthys, and Seth.
So Shu, Tefnet, and Geb and Nut were all siblings?
Yeah, so they're all up in the sky. They're kind of like the gods, like the higher level gods. And then we have the gods that are down on Earth. He's still up there. He's busy just transporting the sun from place to place. Right? So he's the sun god.
He doesn't really have the throne. He didn't have the throne.
No, he's the sun god. He's kind of in the same way that we would see God the Father. He's up there. He's doing it, yeah, kind of like Zeus, right? So Ra is always depicted with this golden disc because he's the sun god. Okay? There are really not depictions, or there are depictions of Shu, Tefnet, Geb, and Nut, but it varies. It varies wildly. Okay? So then we have Isis and Osiris, their brother and sister. They're married, and Osiris is ruling Egypt. We have a lot of brother-sister relationships, not just in the gods, but also in the pharaohs. We'll see that. It's gross, whatever. Move on. Okay?
Didn't they have to do it though because there weren't a lot of people?
There were a lot of people in the times of the pharaohs, but it was seen as keeping the bloodline clean. Yep. So we have Isis and Osiris. By the way, this is all mythology. This didn't actually happen, just so we know. Osiris is ruling over everything. Seth, the evil god, he gets jealous. He kills Osiris, scatters his body all throughout the desert. Isis, with the help of her sister Nephthys, goes and they basically find all the pieces of his body. And with the help of Thoth and Anubis, these are the two of the gods below, they piece Osiris back together. And then he starts to rule again. So Osiris is always seen as green. So you'll see depictions of Osiris, he's green, and he looks like he's a mummy. He's wrapped up because they patched him back up together. This was the first mummy. This is why the Egyptians will mummify people, because it was done for Osiris. After he's put back to life, back together and mummified, then they have a baby. Bad timing, but they do. This is their son Horus, right? So just below them, this is their son Horus. And he is kind of the patron saint or the patron god, we would say, of all of the pharaohs from here on out. You can see how Horus is wearing the double crown. He's wearing the white crown in the middle, and then he's wearing the red crown. This is showing his kingship over the upper Nile and the lower Nile at the same time. So the pharaohs are always going to take Horus as their patron. They're going to see themselves as the reincarnation or the re-embodiment, or at least having the power of, different pharaohs are going to see different ways, the embodiment of Horus. Yeah.
So they believe in resurrection and incarnation?
Some of them did believe in reincarnation. A lot of them didn't. It's more of, I am sharing in the power of the god. So I am a demigod, or I am godlike. The pharaohs believed that all of the pharaohs became gods and entered into the god kingdom after they died. While they were on Earth, they were kind of like gods in training or demigods or something. It's kind of hard to put into our language, but it's that sort of thing. Okay?
So what does Hathor do?
Hathor we haven't gotten to. She's sort of carries some of the same powers of Ra, right? Of light and darkness, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So out of Shu, Tefnet, Geb, and Nut, who gave birth to all four of those?
Different, depending on different translations you read. They're all siblings. They all give birth to these siblings.
Interesting.
Okay. So the main guys you need to know are Osiris. He's kind of like the head pharaoh king, but he's very weak, and so Horus is ruling for him. Right? His son with Isis, they're ruling for him. And then we have Anubis. He's the god of the underworld. Thot, who's also a god of the underworld. We're going to get more into detail on those guys. And then Seth, he's the bad god. Right? He's the god of, he's kind of like Loki. He's the god of darkness and chaos and all that kind of stuff. Right? Yeah, very much so. There's a lot of similarities between Loki in the Norse tradition and Seth in the Egyptian traditions. You see a lot of that. Okay? There's going to be different spellings and different translations of all these names as well. So sometimes you'll just see it written S-E-T as Set, sometimes as Seth. Again, there's not going to be perfect translations between hieroglyphics and Roman language.
What is
Who's Hathor?
We'll get to Hathor a little bit later.
what is Thot, the god
He's
of?
special.
Also a god of the underworld, I think of judgment, I think.
What was the other one that was in the world? It was Thought and what?
Anubis. Anubis is the god of the underworld.
Oh, so they're both gods of the
I think so. I think so. I'll double check on that. Okay. In the, we're also going to see these symbols quite a bit as we move forward. And you're also going to see the gods and goddesses holding these as in that sheet as well. So we have what's called the Ankh. So the Ankh is showing life. So that's a depiction of life, the key of life.
What is which one?
The Ankh.
Oh yeah, is it Seth
Mm-hmm.
and Horus?
A couple of them are holding
A lot
that.
of them have it, like the gods of the underworld.
Oh yeah.
Wait, is this the symbol of what?
The life.
Gods of the underworld.
So that's on your sheet as well. Because they're transitioning you to eternal life. I don't know. We have Ankh. Ankh.
Unk with an H.
Ankh.
How do you spell it?
It's on your handout.
Oh, on the
On the actual handout, yeah, it's on there.
oh, it's like on the notes.
And then we have what's called the Jed. This is an ancient Egyptian symbol meaning stability. It's the symbolic backbone of the god Osiris. So this is a depiction of the backbone of Osiris. This just means stability. Again, very, very important for the Egyptians to have this symbol for stability.
What was it called?
The Jed, D-J-E-D. Okay, so these definitions are all on your sheet there as well.
Where's the Jed? Who
Oh,
is
right
that?
there.
I don't see anyone holding that on this sheet, but it's often held by pharaohs. You're often going to see them or have a depiction of it next to a pharaoh. Next we have what's called the was. The was is it's a stylized animal head on the top of a long straight staff with a forked end. Very similar to how Catholics use a crozier or a bishop uses a crozier. It's showing dominion, power over the land and over the people as well. So sometimes it would actually be an animal head, but oftentimes it's just seen as like a staff with a simple kind of semi-curved. Mm-hmm. And then we have the crook and flail. I don't have a depiction of that on the slideshow, but the crook and the flail, you'll see depictions of the pharaohs holding that, usually with their arms crossed. If you look closely at Osiris, you can see he's holding that. So the crook, it's basically a very small, like shepherd's staff, and then the flail, it's a stick with, like almost like a whip, again showing power and dominion as well. So those two symbols show power and dominion as well. The attributes of the deity Osiris, the shepherd's crook stood for kingship, and the flail for the fertility of the land. Okay? So those are the symbols that you're going to need to know as we move forward. All right, we're going to pause there. We'll continue next time. So I'm trying to get through, the reason we started class 6 today was that so we'd have a little bit of time to review before your test.
When's the test again?
It'll be Tuesday.